Some loneliness cuts deeper than any sword. After 30 years of conquest and bloodshed, the most feared Viking warrior in Norway sits by his dying fire, carrying a wound no battle ever gave him. Bjorn Ironsoul stands 7 feet tall, with hands that crushed enemy shields. His name once struck terror across the northern seas, but tonight he speaks a truth that shames him. No woman has ever truly wanted him. They came for his gold, feared his reputation, but never saw the man beneath. The legend, until Freydis arrives, a young woman mocked for her size. She sees something in this giant warrior that no one else ever has. When she kisses him, it's not from pity, but from something deeper. Can one moment of unexpected tenderness heal a lifetime of loneliness? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to Bjorn's weathered hands as he worked the nets by the fjord's edge. Each pull of rope carried the weight of decades, not just the fish struggling in hemp mesh, but memories of battles where his hands had gripped different weapons entirely. His war axe, Skullbiter, hung silent on the wall of his modest longhouse, its edge dulled not by combat, but by neglect. The weapon that had cleaved through enemy shields and carved his legend into the sagas now served only as a reminder of what he once was. The village of Ravenshollow existed at the world's edge, where the sea met sky in an endless dance of grey and blue. 43 souls called this place home, most born here, most destined to die here. They knew Bjorn's name before he arrived 3 winters past, had heard the tales sung by travelling skalds. Bjorn, the Ironsoul. Bjorn, the berserker. Bjorn, who had stood alone against 20 Danish warriors at Stamford Bridge and walked away while they did not. Yet now, watching him mend nets with the patience of a man who had nowhere else to be, they struggled to reconcile legend with reality. This giant, who measured his days not in conquests, but in quiet labor. This warrior who spoke to no one unless spoken to first, who bought his bread with silver coins, worn smooth by worried fingers. "Still can't believe he's real," muttered Gunnar the fisherman to his nephew Olaf as they prepared their own boat nearby. "Thought the stories were just stories?" "He's real enough," Olaf replied, stealing glances at Bjorn's massive frame. "Look at those scars. That one across his shoulder. That's where Jarl Eric's sword found him at the Battle of Stamford." "My father was there," said Bjorn, pulled the blade out himself and kept fighting. Gunnar shook his head. "And now he fixes nets like any common fisherman. The mighty do fall far." But Bjorn heard their whispers as he heard them all. In 3 years, not one villager had approached him with anything more than necessary commerce. They paid him fair coin for the fish he caught, nodded respectfully when their paths crossed, but always kept that careful distance reserved for dangerous things. He understood. A man didn't earn a reputation like his by being safe company. Loneliness had become a familiar ache, like an old wound that throbbed before storms. In his raiding days, he'd been surrounded by warriors who respected his skill, but feared his battle rage. Shield brothers who would follow him into the gates of hell itself, but who grew quiet when the fighting ended and camp was made. Even then, especially then, he'd felt apart from them. Women had come to him, of course. Victory brought spoils, and a successful raider attracted attention. But their eyes always held the same look, calculating, fearful, or hungry for the gold he carried. Never soft, never warm, never seeing past the blood on his hands to whatever lay beneath. He'd tried in those early years, tried to be gentle with a thrall girl named Astrid who'd been kind to him. But kindness born of fear wasn't the same as affection, and he'd learned to recognize the difference. She'd flinched when he touched her face, had closed her eyes as if bracing for pain rather than opening them to welcome love. After that, he'd stopped trying, told himself it was better this way. A warrior's path was solitary. His reputation grew. Fiercer, his rage in battle more terrible, and the careful distance others kept from him, widened into a chasm that seemed impossible to cross. The nets completed, Bjorn gathered his tools and turned toward the village proper. His longhouse sat apart from the others, built where the forest met the settlement's edge. He'd chosen the location deliberately, close enough to trade and buy supplies, far enough that his presence didn't cast a shadow over daily life. As he walked the worn dirt path, he noticed the usual ripple of awareness that followed him. Mothers calling children inside, men finding sudden urgent business elsewhere, dogs that had barked at strangers but fell silent when he passed. Only old Magnus the blacksmith ever held his ground, offering gruff nods that carried neither fear nor false friendship, just the acknowledgement of one craftsman recognizing another's skill. "Good morning, Ironsoul," Magnus called from his forge, hammer pausing mid-strike against the glowing iron he was shaping. "Good morning, Magnus. Nets holding well?" Well enough. It was the same exchange they'd shared for 3 years, brief, practical, free of the nervous energy that marked most people's interactions with him. Magnus had lost his left arm in a raid. 20 years past, understood something about learning to live with what remained rather than mourning what was gone. The market square buzzed with its usual morning activity. Farmers selling root vegetables and preserved meats, fishermen hawking their dawn catches, women haggling over prices with the fierce determination of those who made every copper count. Bjorn moved through it all like a ship through fog, present but untouched, acknowledged but not engaged. He bought his weekly supplies from Sigrid the baker, a woman whose husband had died in the same raid that took Magnus's arm. She always had. His bread ready, counted his change with brisk efficiency, and maintained the polite fiction that his presence didn't make her nervous. It was, in its way, a kindness, the usual loaves, Ironsoul? Yes, and perhaps some of that honey cake if you have it. I do. She wrapped the purchase in clean cloth, movements quick and sure. Storm coming in from the west. You might want to secure your boat. Thank you for the warning. Another ritual completed, another day begun. Bjorn tucked the bread under his arm and turned to leave when a commotion near the well caught his attention. A group of village women had gathered in a tight circle, their voices carrying the particular pitch that marked gossip turned cruel. "Think she's a scold. Can you believe it?" one was saying. "Fat as she is, dreaming of composing sagas. Who would listen to verses from someone who can't even see her own feet? My husband says it's shameful. A woman of her size should focus on useful work, not foolish dreams." Their laughter cut through the morning air like broken glass. In the Uidza, center of their circle, stood a young woman Bjorn had noticed before, but never truly seen. Freydis, he remembered someone calling her. Daughter of Thorvald the rope-maker. She stood straighter than the others despite their mockery, chin raised in defiance, even as color bloomed across her round cheeks. "I don't see how my interests concern any of you," she said, voice steady, though her hands trembled slightly. "Last I heard, the gods gave voices to all, not just those who meet your standards of appearance." "The gods gave you other gifts, dear," replied Helga, the miller's wife. "Perhaps you should focus on those instead of embarrassing yourself with poetry no one wants to hear." Bjorn found himself taking a step closer, drawn by something in Freydis's stance. She was indeed larger than the other women, but not in the way they made it sound, not in a way that suggested weakness or shame. There was strength in how she carried herself, dignity in her refusal to be cowed by their vicious tongues. "I've heard stranger dreams come true," Freydis replied. "Perhaps the gods have plans you can't imagine." "The gods!" scoffed another woman. "You have better things to do than listen to verses from someone who what?" The voice that cut through the conversation belonged to Bjorn, though he hadn't realized he'd spoken until all eyes turned toward him. The circle of women stepped back instinctively, their cruel confidence evaporating like morning mist. Silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Even in his current life of peaceful exile, Bjorn's presence commanded immediate attention. 7 feet, of muscle and scars, with eyes that had seen too much death to be impressed by petty cruelty. "I asked you a question," he said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Who what?" Helga's face had gone pale. We were only saying..." "You were saying what, exactly?" "Nothing of importance, Ironsoul. Just women's talk." Bjorn's gaze moved from face to face, watching them squirm under his attention. Then his eyes found Freydis, who alone hadn't stepped back. She watched him with curiosity rather than fear, head tilted slightly as if trying to solve a puzzle. "I've known many skalds," Bjorn said, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet market square. "Good ones and poor ones, wise ones and foolish ones, fat ones and thin ones. Funny thing about poetry, it doesn't care what the poet looks like, only whether they have something worth saying." He turned to Freydis directly. "What kind of verses do you compose?" The question seemed to surprise her. Mostly about the sea. The way it changes with the weather, with the seasons. Sometimes about the old stories, but told differently. Differently how? From perspectives that don't usually get heard. What the shield maiden felt before her first battle. What the farmer's wife thought when the raiders came. She paused, glancing at the other women. What the outsiders saw when they looked at us. Something stirred in Bjorn's chest, unfamiliar and warm. Sounds like the kind of verses worth hearing. The other women began to disperse, their appetite for cruelty diminished by his presence. Soon only Freydis remained by the well, studying him with those thoughtful eyes. "Thank you," she said simply. "That was kind." "I didn't do it to be kind." "Why then?" Bjorn considered the question. Why had he intervened? It wasn't his nature to involve himself in village politics or personal squabbles, yet something about watching her stand alone against their mockery had stirred memories of his own isolation, his own experience of being judged by surface appearances rather than deeper truths. "Because I know something about being misunderstood," he said finally. Freydis nodded slowly. "Yes, I imagine you do." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the morning sun climbing higher above the fjord. Around them the market resumed its normal rhythm, but Bjorn felt something had shifted, not dramatically, just a small crack in the wall of solitude he'd built around himself. "I should go," he said, remembering the bread under his arm, the storm Magnus had mentioned. "Of course. Thank you again, Bjorn Ironsoul." As he walked away, Bjorn found himself wondering about those verses she composed, about perspectives that didn't usually get heard, about what the outsiders saw when they looked at people like them. For the first time in 3 years, the path to his lonely longhouse felt longer than usual. The storm Magnus had predicted arrived with the fury of an angry god. Bjorn secured his boat and battened down his longhouse as wind howled through the village like a berserker's war cry. Rain lashed the coastline in sheets, turning the fjord into a cauldron of grey-green foam. For 2 days, the tempest raged, trapping everyone indoors with nothing but firelight and old stories for company. On the 3rd morning, an unnatural quiet settled over Raven's Hollow, the kind of silence that follows destruction. Heavy with the weight of what has been lost, Bjorn emerged from his longhouse to find the village transformed. Fishing boats had been tossed inland like children's toys. Roofs gaped where thatch had been torn away. The ancient oak that had stood in the market square for 3 generations lay uprooted, its massive trunk blocking the main path. But it was the crowd gathered near the docks that drew his attention. Their voices carried urgency, fear, and something else, a note of desperate hope that made his warrior instinct stir. As he approached, the familiar pattern of whispers and stepping aside marked his passage. But today, the deference felt different. Less fearful, more expectant. "Ironsoul," called Magnus, his weathered face grim. "You need to see this." The blacksmith led him through the crowd to where the storm had carved a new channel in the shoreline. Where once gentle waves had lapped against familiar stones, Now a treacherous gap yawned between the village and a small rocky outcrop 50 yards offshore. And on that outcrop, barely visible through the morning mist, a figure huddled against the cold. "It's Freydis," said Thorvald, the rope-maker whose daughter she was. His voice cracked with barely contained panic. The storm surge must have caught her. She was helping old Einar secure his nets when the water rose. Bjorn studied the churning water between shore and rock. The new channel ran deep and fast, fed by the fjord's angry current. Swimming, it would be challenging for an experienced warrior. In calm conditions, in this chaos with hypothermia already setting in, it would be nearly impossible. "We've tried throwing ropes," continued Thorvald, "but the distance is too great, and she's too weak to catch them. Been out there all night. Several villagers had attempted rescue. Young Olaf had made it halfway before the current swept him back to shore, nearly drowning in the process. Eric the hunter had tried to reach her in his small fishing boat, but the waves had almost dashed him against the rocks. Now they stood helpless, watching one of their own slowly freeze to death, within sight of safety. "She's not moving much anymore," whispered Sigrid the baker. "I don't think she has long." Bjorn felt something cold settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with the morning air. He thought of Freydis standing defiant against the cruel words of the village women. Her voice speaking of perspectives that didn't usually get heard. The way she'd looked at him without fear, as if seeing something others missed. "I'll get her," he said simply. The crowd turned to stare at him. Several voices rose in protest. "The current's too strong, even for you," Magnus said. "We've lost enough people to this storm." "Look at those waves," added Eric. "They'll dash you against the rocks." But Bjorn was already stripping off his heavy cloak and boots. The logical part of his mind agreed with their concerns. The water was treacherous, the rescue attempt potentially suicidal, yet something deeper than logic drove him forward. The same instinct that had carried him through countless battles when the odds seemed impossible. "Ironsoul, please." Thorvald grabbed his arm. "I know what she means to you after yesterday, but I can't lose you both." Bjorn paused, meeting the older man's desperate gaze. "What she means to me, the way you defended her, the way you looked." "At her?" Thorvald's voice broke. "Like she mattered!" The words hit Bjorn with unexpected force. Like she mattered. Such a simple phrase, yet it carried weight beyond its syllables. When had anyone last mattered to him? When had he last mattered to anyone beyond his reputation or his gold? "She does matter," he said quietly, "and I won't let her die while I stand here safe." Without waiting for further protest, Bjorn waded into the churning water. The cold struck him like a physical blow, driving the breath from his lungs. The current immediately tried to sweep him downstream, but 30 years of wielding war hammers had given his arms the strength to fight the fjord's pull. He swam with the desperate efficiency of a man who had learned early that hesitation meant death. Each stroke was calculated, using the current's force rather than fighting it directly. When waves threatened to overwhelm him, he dove beneath their fury, navigating by instinct and experience. Halfway across, his muscles began to cramp from the cold. The outcrop seemed impossibly distant, though he knew he'd covered most of the gap. Behind him, the villagers' shouts had faded to whispers on the wind. Ahead, Freydis remained motionless, a small figure against the dark stone. The final approach proved most treacherous. Waves battered the rocks with bone-crushing force, and Bjorn had to time his arrival perfectly to avoid being smashed against the stone. He caught hold of a jutting ledge just as a massive wave swept over him, threatening to tear his grip loose. When the water receded, he hauled himself onto the outcrop and found Freydis unconscious, her lips blue with cold. Her breathing came in shallow gasps, and her skin felt like ice beneath his touch. She wore a simple woolen dress, now soaked and offering no protection against the elements. "Freydis," he called, cradling her against his chest. "Freydis, wake up!" Her eyelids fluttered, and for a moment consciousness returned. When she saw his face above her, confusion gave way to something like wonder. "Bjorn?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "What are you? How did you—" "Saving you," he said simply, but I need you to help me. Can you hold on while I swim us back?" She tried to nod, but the effort seemed to exhaust her. "I'm so cold, can't feel my hands." Bjorn looked back across the channel, calculating. The return journey would be even more difficult carrying another person, especially one too weak to assist. But the alternative was watching her die in his arms, and that was unacceptable. He wrapped his cloak around her, pulling her close against his chest. Her slight weight felt precious, fragile, like something that could be lost if he wasn't careful enough. "Listen to me," he said urgently. "I'm going to get you home, but you have to stay conscious. Can you do that?" "I'll try." Her eyes found his, and despite her weakness, he saw determination there. "Why did you come for me?" The question caught him off guard. In the urgency of rescue, he hadn't examined his motivations. Now, with her life depending on his next actions, the answer came with startling clarity, because no one else would. It was true, but not complete. The whole truth was more complex, more frightening. He'd come because the thought of losing her, this woman who saw perspectives others missed, who stood alone against cruelty with dignity intact, felt like losing something he hadn't known he needed. The journey back tested every reserve of strength and will Bjorn possessed. Swimming one-handed while supporting Freydis, fighting both current and cold, required him to reach depths of endurance he'd rarely touched even in battle. Twice, waves nearly tore her from his grasp. Once, cramps seized his legs so violently, he thought they would both drown, but somehow, impossibly, they reached the shore. Willing hands pulled them from the water as Bjorn's strength finally gave out. He collapsed onto the rocky beach, Freydis still clutched against his chest, both of them barely conscious. "Get them to my house," Magnus commanded. "Build up the fire. We need to warm them slowly." As villagers carried them to safety, Bjorn felt Freydis's fingers tighten weakly around his hand. Through chattering teeth, she whispered something that made his heart stop. "Thank you for seeing me." 4 words that changed everything. In that moment, as consciousness faded and warmth began to return to his frozen limbs, Bjorn understood that the most dangerous thing wasn't the storm or the churning water. It was the crack that had opened in his carefully constructed solitude, a crack that let in light, hope, and the terrifying possibility that he might not have to spend the rest of his life alone. Bjorn woke to the sound of crackling fire and hushed voices. Woolen blankets covered him to his chin, and the scent of pine smoke mixed with something herbal, willow bark tea, his grandmother would have called it. The aches in his muscles told him how close he'd come to the edge, how much the rescue had cost him. "He's stirring," someone said softly. Magnus, by the sound of it. "About time," replied a woman's voice, unfamiliar but kind. "I was beginning to worry we'd lose him to fever." Bjorn opened his eyes to find himself in Magnus's workshop, moved from the forge to the living quarters where a large hearth provided steady warmth. The blacksmith sat nearby, carving a piece of wood with methodical precision. A middle-aged woman he didn't recognize tended a pot hanging over the fire, stirring something that smelled of roots and herbs. "Where is Freydis?" His voice came out as a croak. "Safe," Magnus assured him. "Alive, thanks to you. Astrid here has been nursing you both." The woman at the fire turned, revealing a face lined with years, but softened by compassion. "I'm Astrid, the healer. Used to tend warriors in the old days, back when raids came regular to these shores. You've had fever for 2 days." 2 days. Bjorn struggled to sit up, his head spinning with the effort. "I need to—" "You need to rest," Astrid interrupted, firmly. "That water nearly killed you. Your body fought off the cold, but it cost you dearly." "The girl recovers faster," Magnus added. "Younger bones, perhaps, or maybe just more stubborn than you." Despite his weakness, Bjorn found himself almost smiling at that. "Where is she now?" "With her father. Thorvald hasn't left her side since. We brought you both back." Magnus set down his carving. A small wooden bird, Bjorn noticed. "Half the village has been by to check on you. Strange thing." "What's strange about it?" In 3 years, you've barely spoken to any of them. Now they act like your family." Astrid ladled soup into a wooden bowl and approached the bed. "Saving one of their own changes how people see you. Before, you were Bjorn the fearsome. Now, you're Bjorn the protector. Different stories carry different weights." Bjorn accepted the soup gratefully, though his hands shook holding the bowl. The broth was rich with fish and vegetables, warming him from the inside out. "I didn't do it for them." "No," Magnus agreed. "That's what makes it matter more." As strength slowly returned to his limbs, Bjorn learned what had transpired during his fever. The village had rallied around both rescued and rescuer with unprecedented unity. Thorvald had brought the finest furs from his stores to keep Bjorn warm. Sigrid had baked special bread with healing herbs. Even the women who'd mocked Freydis at the well had contributed to his care, not from guilt, though that played a part, but from genuine gratitude. "They see you differently now," Astrid explained as she changed the poultices on his chest. "Before, you were a legend living among them. Now you're a man who risked everything for someone who mattered to him. That's something they can understand." The words carried implications Bjorn wasn't ready to examine. Did Freydis matter to him? The memory of her fingers gripping his hand, her whispered thanks, suggested something had indeed shifted. But acknowledging it felt dangerous, like opening a door he'd kept barred for good reason. On the 3rd morning of his recovery, Thorvald appeared at Magnus's door, bearing a bundle wrapped in finest wool. "My daughter wishes to see you," the rope-maker said without preamble. "But first, she asked me to bring you this." Bjorn unwrapped the bundle to reveal his war axe, Skullbiter, but transformed. The metal gleamed with fresh oil and careful polishing. The leather grip had been re-wrapped with intricate knotwork, and new silver inlays decorated the blade. Not gaudy additions, but subtle improvements that enhanced rather than changed the weapon's character. "She did this?" Bjorn asked, running. His fingers along the renewed grip. "Insisted on it, though I had to help with the metalwork." Thorvald's voice carried paternal pride mixed with puzzlement. "Said it wasn't right for a hero's weapon to hang forgotten. Spent hours working on those silver patterns, Norse knots for protection and strength," she said. Bjorn hefted the axe, feeling its familiar weight and balance. But now it carried something new, evidence that someone had seen value in what he'd cast aside. That someone thought his old life worth honoring, even as he tried to build a new one. "She wants to thank you properly," Thorvald continued, "if you're strong enough to visit." The walk to Thorvald's house took longer than it should have, but Bjorn's curiosity drove him forward, despite his weakness. He found Freydis sitting in her father's workshop, surrounded by coils of rope in various stages of completion. Afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows lit her auburn hair like burnished copper. "Bjorn," she said, rising to greet him. Her color had returned, and though she moved carefully, she seemed fully recovered. "How are you feeling?" "Better. Thank you for this." He held up the axe. It was kind work. Not kind. Necessary. She gestured for him to sit on a bench across from her. "A weapon like that carries too much history to be ignored. I thought it deserved respect." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the awkwardness of their new connection filling the space between them. Bjorn found himself studying her face, noting details he'd missed before. The intelligence in her green eyes, the slight upturn at the corners of her mouth that suggested humor held in reserve. The way she held herself, not with the defeated posture he'd expected after years of mockery, but with quiet dignity. "You didn't have to come for me," she said finally. "Yes, I did. Why?" The same question she'd asked on the rocks, but now they had time for a complete answer. Bjorn considered his words carefully, knowing they would matter. "In all my years of fighting, I learned to recognize courage. Real courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what needs doing despite the fear. Standing at that well, facing those women alone, that took courage. Letting someone like that die when I could prevent it?" He shook his head. "That would have been cowardice," Freydis smiled, and the expression transformed her face completely. "Someone like that? someone who sees things others miss, who finds perspectives that don't usually get heard. He paused, then added quietly, someone who doesn't judge by surface appearances. The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Freydis studied his face with the same thoughtful attention she'd shown at the market square. "I've been thinking about what you said," she told him. "About knowing something about being misunderstood." "Have you?" "Yes, and I think maybe we understand each other better than most people understand either of us." It was a simple observation, but it struck Bjorn with unexpected force. Here was someone who might truly see him. Not the legend or the reputation, but the man who'd grown tired of violence and yearned for something gentler. The possibility was both thrilling and terrifying. "Perhaps we do," he said carefully. "Would you like to hear one of my poems?" The question came suddenly, as if she'd been gathering courage to ask it. "Very much." Freydis straightened, her voice taking on the practiced cadence of a skald as she began to recite. But these weren't verses about glorious battles or heroic deeds. Instead, she painted word pictures of the sea's changing moods, of the way morning light transformed familiar landscapes, of the quiet heroism found in daily kindness. As he listened, Bjorn felt something he hadn't experienced in decades, the simple pleasure of being seen, understood, and accepted for who he was, rather than what he'd done. The poem Freydis recited stayed with Bjorn long after he'd returned to his longhouse. Her words painted the sea not as a highway for warriors, but as a living thing with moods and memories, capable of both fury and tenderness. She'd spoken of waves that carried whispered secrets from distant shores, of storms that wept for the ships they'd claimed, of calm mornings when the water reflected not just sky, but the souls of those who gazed upon it. No skald in any mead hall had ever composed verses like these. They possessed a gentleness, an intimacy that felt revolutionary after a lifetime of hearing poetry that glorified violence and conquest. 3 days passed before he returned to Thorvald's workshop. He told himself it was to discuss repairs to his boat, damaged in the storm. But when he arrived and found Freydis alone, working on a complex rope pattern, he knew he'd come for different reasons entirely. "My father's visiting Magnus about some metalwork," she explained, without looking up from her intricate knotting. "But you're welcome to wait. Actually, I came to ask you something." Her hands stilled on the rope. "What kind of something? Would you teach me about poetry? About seeing things the way you see them?" The question surprised them both. Bjorn hadn't planned to ask it, but hearing himself speak the words, he realized how much he meant them. For 30 years, he'd viewed the world through a warrior's eyes. Every person a potential threat, every landscape evaluated for tactical advantage, every situation measured by its capacity for violence. Freydis offered a different lens entirely. "You want to learn poetry?" she asked, incredulous. "I want to learn to see beauty instead of battlefields." The honesty of his admission hung between them. Freydis set down her rope work and studied his face, searching for mockery or hidden motives. Finding neither, her expression softened into something like wonder. "No one's ever asked me to teach them anything before. Then we'll both be learning something new." They began meeting in the afternoons, when the day's essential work was done. Sometimes in Thorvald's workshop, sometimes walking the shoreline. Paths, occasionally sitting in the meadow above the village, where wildflowers painted the grass in colors that changed with the light. Freydis proved a patient teacher, showing Bjorn how to notice details he'd never considered important. The way shadows shifted across familiar buildings, how bird songs varied with the weather, the subtle differences in how people moved when they were happy versus when they carried burdens. "Poetry isn't just about words," she explained during one of their coastal walks. "It's about attention, about caring enough to really see what's in front of you." Bjorn found the lessons more challenging than any battle he'd fought. His mind, trained for decades to categorize and evaluate threats, struggled to appreciate nuance for its own sake. When Freydis pointed out how the afternoon sun turned ordinary pebbles into gems, his first instinct was to note potential footing, hazards. When she spoke of cloud formations telling stories across the sky, he saw weather patterns that might affect sailing conditions. But gradually, persistently, she wore down his defenses against beauty. "Tell me what you see," she said one afternoon, gesturing toward the fjord, where fishing boats dotted the water like scattered leaves. Boats, men working, good conditions for... No, her interruption was gentle but firm. "Don't tell me what they're doing. Tell me what they look like, how they make you feel." Bjorn forced himself to look again, trying to set aside 3 decades of pragmatic observation. "They look small against all that water, but not helpless, like they belong. There, better, what else? The way the light catches their sails, makes them glow like lanterns. Yes, and they move with the waves instead of fighting them. There's wisdom in that." He paused, surprised by his own words. "Grace, even." Freydis smiled, and her approval warmed him more than he'd expected. "Now you're beginning to see like a poet." Their lessons weren't one-sided. While Freydis taught him about beauty and perspective, Bjorn found himself sharing stories from his traveling years. Not the brutal tales of conquest that filled most warrior sagas, but quieter observations about the places he'd seen and the people he'd encountered. He told her about the monastery in Ireland where monks illuminated manuscripts with colors so vibrant they seemed to hold captured light. About a mountain village where children played a singing game that had been passed down for centuries, their voices echoing off stone walls like prayers. About markets in distant lands where spices filled the air with scents that could transport a man to other worlds entirely. "You've seen so much," Freydis said wistfully after he'd described the aurora dancing over a Greenland settlement. "I've never been farther than the next village. Seeing places isn't the same as understanding them," Bjorn replied. "I traveled to the edges of the known world, but I never really looked at what was in front of me. You've seen more in this one fjord than I saw in all my wandering." The comment delighted her, and Bjorn found himself treasuring these moments when her face lit up with genuine pleasure. It occurred to him that making Freydis smile had become one of his favorite activities, a realization that both thrilled and worried him. Their growing friendship didn't go unnoticed in the village. Thorvald watched their interactions with the careful attention of a protective father, but his initial wariness had given way to cautious approval. Magnus made knowing comments about how much time Bjorn spent away from his own house. Even Sigrid the baker had begun asking after "your lady" friend when he came to buy bread, but not everyone regarded their connection favorably. The same women who'd mocked Freydis at the well now whispered different accusations, that she was using feminine wiles to entrap the famous warrior, that no good could come of such an unlikely pairing, that she was reaching above her station. These whispers reached Bjorn's ears one market day when he overheard Helga speaking to her friends near the grain merchant's stall. "Mark my words, no good will come of this. Men like him don't form lasting attachments to women like her. He'll tire of her novelty soon enough, and then where will she be?" "Worse than before," agreed another woman. "At least now people just ignore her. After he's done with her, she'll be truly ruined." Bjorn felt his old battle rage stirring, the familiar red tide that had made him feared across the northern seas. But before he could act on the impulse, Freydis herself appeared at his side, her hand touching his arm with gentle restraint. "There, not worth your anger," she said quietly, "and proving them right about your temper won't help anything." Her wisdom cooled his fury more effectively than any tactical consideration could have. As they walked away together, Bjorn found himself marveling at how she'd read his mood and responded with exactly the right words. "Does it bother you?" he asked. "What they say about us? Some days more than others. But I've learned that people who've never taken risks themselves rarely understand those who do. Is that what this is? A risk?" She stopped walking and turned to face him, her green eyes serious. "What else would you call it? A friendship between the loneliest man in the village and the woman everyone loves to pity. Of course it's a risk," the word hung between them. heavy with implication. Because friendship, Bjorn was beginning to suspect, wasn't quite what this was becoming. Summer brought the longest days of the year to Raven's Hollow, when twilight stretched until nearly midnight and dawn arrived while most still slept. It was during one of these extended evenings that Bjorn found himself walking the clifftop path with Freydis, their usual afternoon lessons having extended well past their normal time. Below them, the fjord caught the last rays of sunlight, like hammered. Silver fishing boats had returned hours ago, their crews now gathered in houses where smoke rose from evening cook-fires. The village settled into the peaceful rhythm of another day's end, but Bjorn felt no urge to return to his empty longhouse. "Tell me about your family," Freydis said as they paused at a weathered stone marker that had stood on this cliff for generations. "Not the warrior stories everyone knows. Your real family." Bjorn touched the ancient rune carved into the stone, a symbol for protection that had watched over travelers for decades. "My father was a blacksmith, like Magnus, but with less patience for conversation. A blacksmith's son who became a berserker. That must have surprised him, terrified him more like." Bjorn's voice carried old pain. "The first time the battle rage took me, I was 14, helping him in the forge when raiders attacked our village. I picked up his warhammer and, when it was over, 7 men lay dead, and I couldn't remember how it happened." Freydis listened without judgment, her attention encouraging him to continue. "My father looked at me like I'd become something monstrous. Maybe I had. The rage was unlike anything he'd seen, unlike anything I'd felt. It consumed everything, fear, doubt, even pain. In battle it made me nearly invincible. In daily life it made me dangerous to be around." "Is that why you left home?" "Partly, but also because word of what I'd done spread quickly. Jarls began sending messages, offering gold and glory if I'd join their raids. My father understood that a blacksmith's peaceful life wasn't meant for someone like me." They resumed walking, following the path as it curved around the headland. The evening air carried the scent of wild roses blooming in protected hollows between the rocks. "Do you miss it?" Freydis asked. "The rage, I mean, the feeling of being invincible." Bjorn considered the question carefully. 3 years ago, he might have answered differently, but now, watching the gentle way evening light played across Freydis's face, the idea of returning to that consuming fury seemed not just unappealing, but impossible. "I miss the certainty," he said finally. "When the rage took hold, there were no doubts, no complex emotions to navigate. Everything became simple: destroy the enemy, protect your brothers, survive until tomorrow. But that simplicity came at a cost. What cost? The ability to feel anything else deeply. Joy, sorrow, tenderness. The rage burned through all of it. I became very good at one thing and terrible at everything else that makes life worth living." Freydis stopped walking and turned to face him, her expression thoughtful. "And now? Now I'm learning there are different kinds of strength. The kind that builds instead of destroys. The kind that protects by creating safety rather than eliminating. The threats. You mean what you did for me during the storm. I mean what you do for me every day." The words escaped before Bjorn could consider their impact. Freydis's eyes widened slightly, and he realized he'd revealed more than he'd intended. But rather than retreat into safer territory, he found himself continuing. "You're teaching me to see beauty where I once saw only tactical advantages. You show me that words can heal as surely as weapons wound. You make me want to be gentler, better than I've ever been." Color rose in Freydis's cheeks, but she didn't look away. "Bjorn, I know it's presumptuous. A man with my history has no right to hope for." He struggled to find words for feelings he'd never learned to express. "But being with you makes me believe I might be capable of more than destruction." The silence that followed stretched long enough for Bjorn to regret his honesty. He'd laid his heart bare to someone who had every reason to fear rather than trust him. But when Freydis finally spoke, her voice was steady and sure. Do you know what I see when I look at you? A killer trying to pretend he's something else. A man who risked his life to save someone most people considered worthless. A man who listens to poetry about wildflowers and sunset colors without laughing. A man who's spent weeks learning to see the world through gentler eyes. She stepped closer, close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her green irises. I see someone who's already become better than he was. Bjorn felt something crack open in his chest, not the violent fracture of battle rage, but something warmer and more profound. Hope, perhaps, or the first stirrings of a love he'd never thought himself capable of feeling. Freydis, he said, her name carrying all the tenderness he'd kept buried for decades. Yes? Would it be presumptuous if I said that If you said what? The question hung between them like a bridge he wasn't sure he had the courage to cross. In the growing twilight, with the eternal fjord spread below them, and the first stars beginning to appear overhead, Bjorn felt as exposed as he'd ever been in battle. But this vulnerability carried no rage to burn it away, no berserker fury to shield him from the consequences of honesty. If I said that these weeks with you have been the happiest of my life, Freydis smiled then, the expression so radiant it seemed to light the gathering darkness around them. It wouldn't be presumptuous at all, because they've been the happiest of mine as well. The admission hung in the air between them, precious and fragile as spun glass. Neither moved to close the remaining distance, both understanding instinctively that this moment was too important to rush. They stood in the growing dusk, two lonely souls who had found unexpected solace in each other's company, while around them the world settled into the peaceful quiet of another northern evening. But even as joy bloomed in Bjorn's heart, a part of his warrior's mind noted the approaching hoofbeats from the village below, riders moving fast, their urgency carrying clearly on the still air. News, most likely. And in his experience, news that arrived at such speed was rarely good. We should head back, he said reluctantly. Freydis nodded, though she seemed as reluctant as he to break the spell of the moment. Tomorrow we could walk the eastern path. There's a hidden cove I'd like to show you. I'd like that very much. They turned back toward the village, neither knowing that the riders below carried word that would change everything. News that would test their newfound connection in ways neither could have imagined. The riders brought news that chilled Bjorn's blood more than any storm-tossed sea. 3 villages along the coast had been raided in the past fortnight, not by foreign enemies, but by a crew of Norse outlaws led by a man Bjorn knew all too well. Grimmer the Red, announced the lead messenger, his horse lathered with sweat from outriding. He's been gathering desperate men all spring, exiles, oathbreakers, warriors, with nothing left to lose. Magnus spat into the dirt. What does he want with settlements this far north? Nothing here worth stealing. That's just it, the messenger continued, his voice grim. He's not after silver or grain. Word is he's hunting someone specific. The village elders had gathered in the market square to hear the news, their faces grave in the torchlight. Bjorn stood at the edge of the crowd, but he felt the weight of suspicious glances. In a community where most had lived their entire lives, in peace, he was the only man present with a reputation that might attract such attention. Did he say who he's hunting? Asked Thorvald, his ropemaker's hands twisted with worry. Aye, a warrior called Bjorn Ironsoul, the messenger's eyes found. Bjorn across the square. Grimmer claims this Ironsoul killed his brother at Stamford Bridge, says he's sworn a blood oath to settle the score. Silence fell like a blade. Every face turned toward Bjorn, expressions ranging from fear to accusation to desperate hope that he might deny the claim. But honesty had become too much a part of his new life for such deception. I remember Grimmer's brother, Bjorn said quietly. Hakon the Redbeard. He was a good warrior who chose the wrong side of a losing battle. You killed him? Magnus asked, though the answer was clear in Bjorn's expression. In single combat, when he challenged me after the main fighting ended. It was a fair fight. witnessed by men from both armies. But Grimmer was always one to nurse grievances rather than accept honorable defeat. The implications struck the gathered villagers like physical blows. Their peaceful settlement had become a target because they'd offered sanctuary to a man with enemies. Families began whispering urgently among themselves. Children were called closer to their parents' sides. "How long before he gets here?" asked Eric the hunter. 2 days, maybe 3, if the weather holds him back. The messenger looked around. The frightened faces. "He's got maybe 30 men with him. Hard fighters, all of them. 30 outlaws against a fishing village defended by farmers and craftsmen. The odds were brutal, and everyone knew it. Bjorn felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders, the burden of being the reason innocent people faced danger. "I'll leave tonight," he announced. "Draw him away from here." "No." The voice that cut through the murmurs belonged to Freydis, who pushed through the crowd to stand beside him. "Running won't solve anything. He'll burn the village anyway, just to make sure you're not hiding here." "She's right," Magnus agreed reluctantly. "Grimmer's reputation for cruelty is well known. If he thinks we've helped you, our fate is sealed whether you stay or go." Bjorn studied the faces around him, people who'd grown to accept him, who'd shown him kindness despite their initial fear. Thorvald, who'd trusted him with his daughter's life. Sigrid, who'd baked bread for him without complaint. Children who no longer hid when he passed. "Then we fight," he said simply. "Fight?" Helga's voice rose to a shriek. "With what? Half the men here have never held a weapon more dangerous than a fishing spear." "I can teach them," Bjorn replied. 2 days isn't much, but it's enough to show basic formations, how to work together instead of dying alone." "And what about the women and children?" demanded another voice. "Where do they go when the fighting starts?" "There's an old cave system." "In the eastern cliffs," offered young Olaf. "My grandfather used to hide the village treasures there during the Danish wars. It's well hidden, defensible." Magnus nodded slowly. "That could work, but Bjorn's right about the training. If we're going to stand against 30 raiders, we need to be more than a mob with farm tools." Over the next 2 days, Bjorn threw himself into preparing Raven's Hollow's defense with the same intensity he'd once brought to planning raids. He taught the fishermen to fight in tight formation, how to use their nets as weapons to entangle enemies, how to coordinate attacks instead of fighting individual duels. The work was exhausting and frequently frustrating. Magnus took to the lessons, with grim determination, his blacksmith's strength serving him well. Eric proved naturally gifted with the spear. But for every quick learner, there were 2 or 3 who struggled with concepts that had become second nature to professional warriors. Throughout it all, Freydis remained by his side, not to learn combat, which she had no aptitude for, but to provide encouragement and practical support. She organized the evacuation plans for the non-combatants, helped prepare food for the defenders, and most importantly, offered Bjorn the emotional anchor he needed to function under pressure. "You're pushing them too hard," she told him after, watching him berate a farmer who'd dropped his spear for the 3rd time. "They're not warriors. They're fishermen and craftsmen trying to protect their families." "Greimer won't care what they are," Bjorn replied. But he heard the harsh edge in his own voice and forced himself to soften it. "You're right. Fear makes them clumsy, and my anger makes the fear worse. Show them confidence instead of desperation. These men respect you. They'll fight harder if they believe you think they can win." It was good advice, and Bjorn took it to heart. The next morning, he approached the training with patience rather than urgency, praising small improvements instead of highlighting failures. The change in the defenders' morale was immediate and remarkable. But even as the villagers grew more confident, Bjorn felt his own anxiety deepening. Not for himself. He'd faced worse odds than 30 outlaws, but for what failure would mean. These people had accepted him, sheltered him, allowed him to find peace and purpose. If his presence brought destruction upon them, the guilt would be worse than any defeat. On the final evening before Grimmer's expected arrival, Bjorn sat alone on the beach, staring out at the dark water where enemy ships would soon appear. The Restored weight of Skullbiter felt familiar in his hands, but also strange, as if he was holding a relic from someone else's life. Second thoughts? Freydis asked, settling beside him on the sand. About fighting? No. About whether I have the right to ask these people to die for my choices. You're not asking them to die for your choices. You're giving them the chance to choose for themselves. She took his hand, her touch warm against his calloused palm. Everyone here could have asked you to leave when the news came. Instead, they chose to stand with you. That means something. What if I'm not worth their faith? Freydis turned to face him fully, her eyes serious in the starlight. The man who saved me from drowning. The man who's spent months learning to see beauty instead of battlefields. The man who's shown more kindness to a scorned woman than anyone in her entire life. She squeezed his hand. You're worth it, Bjorn. You're worth fighting for. Her words kindled something in his chest, not the old berserker rage, but something steadier and more enduring. Tomorrow would bring violence, blood, and possibly death. But tonight, sitting beside the woman who taught him to hope, Bjorn felt more prepared for battle than he had in years. The ships appeared at dawn, their dark sails cutting through the morning mist like harbingers of doom. Bjorn counted the vessels from his position on the watchtower Magnus had hastily constructed. 4 longships, each carrying 7 or 8 men, fewer than the 30 they'd expected, but still overwhelming odds for a village of fishermen and craftsmen. They're beaching on the southern shore, called Eric from his position at the signal fire. Just like you predicted, Bjorn nodded grimly. The southern approach offered the only suitable landing for ships that size, which was why he'd concentrated their defenses there. Trenches disguised with brush, sharpened stakes hidden in the surf, a funnel formation that would force the raiders into a killing ground where superior numbers would matter less. Remember, he called to the defenders, taking their positions. Let them come to us. Don't break formation no matter what happens. Trust your training and trust each other. The words felt hollow even as he spoke them. 2 days of preparation couldn't transform farmers into warriors, and everyone knew it. But sometimes hope was more important than truth. As Grimmer's raiders dragged their ships onto the beach, Bjorn felt the familiar pre-battle tension coiling in his muscles. His hand found the grip of Skullbiter automatically, the restored weapon, feeling both comforting and strange. 3 years of peace had dulled his edge, but some skills never fully disappeared. The enemy formed up with the casual efficiency of men accustomed to violence. Grimmer himself was unmistakable. A giant nearly as tall as Bjorn, but broader through the shoulders, his red beard streaked with grey, and his armor bearing the scars of countless battles. He carried a war hammer that had probably crushed dozens of skulls, and when he smiled it was the expression of a man who enjoyed his work. Bjorn Ironsoul. Grimmer's voice boomed across the beach. I've come to collect a debt owed in blood. Then come and collect it. Bjorn shouted back, stepping forward from the village's defensive line. But know that innocent people will die if you press this fight. Innocent. Grimmer laughed, the sound harsh as breaking stone. There are no innocents here, brother killer. Only those who chose to shelter a murderer. The accusation stung because it carried truth. These people were in danger because of choices Bjorn had made years before any of them had known his name. But before guilt could weaken his resolve, Freydis's voice reached him from the watchtower, where she and the other non-combatants were supposed to be taking shelter. The only murderer here is the one who attacks families in their homes, she called out, her clear voice carrying across the morning air. Bjorn Ironsoul saved my life. He's protected this village and harmed no one. Grimmer's attention shifted to the tower, his eyes narrowing as he spotted Freydis among the faces peering down. Ah, he said, his voice taking on a different quality. And what's this? The famous berserker has found himself a woman. The way he spoke the words made Bjorn's blood run cold. There was calculation in Grimmer's tone, the sound of a man who just discovered an unexpected advantage. How touching, Grimmer continued, raising his voice so everyone could hear. The wolf learns to love the sheep. Tell me, Ironsoul, does she know what you really are? Does she know how many men you've killed, how many villages you've burned, how many women you've left widowed and childless? That was war, Bjorn replied, but he felt the certainty draining from his voice. And it's finished. Is it? Grimmer began walking forward, his hammer loose in his grip. Because I remember a different Bjorn Ironsoul. I remember the man who laughed while cutting down my brother, who boasted afterward about how easy it had been, who said that weaklings like Hakon deserved whatever death they found. The words hit Bjorn like physical blows, because they were true, at least partially. He had laughed during that fight, caught up in the berserker rage that made violence feel like joy. He had boasted afterward, drunk on victory and glory. He had been casual, even cruel, in dismissing Hakon's death. Look at him, Grimmer called to the village defenders, his voice poisonous with mock sympathy. Look at your great protector's face. See how he doesn't deny what I've said? This is the man you're prepared to die for, a killer who's fooled you into thinking he's changed. Doubt began to spread through the defensive line like cracks in winter ice. Men glanced at each other uncertainly. Some took half steps backward. The careful formation Bjorn had drilled into them started to waver. But before panic could take hold, Magnus stepped forward from his position at the line's center. "Aye," the blacksmith said loudly, his voice carrying the authority of age and experience. "He's killed men, burned villages, done things he probably regrets now. But you know what else he's done." Magnus raised his hammer, not as a weapon but as a symbol. "He pulled my neighbor's daughter from storm-tossed waters while the rest of us stood helpless on shore. He spent months teaching that same daughter to see beauty in a world that showed her only cruelty. He's worked beside us, shared our burdens, asked for nothing but the chance to live in peace." Other voices joined Magnus's, building into a chorus of support that surprised everyone, including Bjorn. "He mended my nets without being asked," called Gunnar. "Gave me silver when my crop failed," added a farmer. "Never raised his voice to my children even when they got underfoot," shouted Sigrid. The declarations continued, each one a small defiance against Grimmer's attempt to poison the well of their resolve. Bjorn felt something shift inside him. Not the old berserker rage, but something warmer and more sustaining. The key knowledge that he'd earned more than their fear. He'd earned their trust. "Touching," Grimmer sneered, but Bjorn could see the calculation behind his eyes had changed. This wasn't going as planned. "But it changes nothing. You're still the man who killed my brother. You still owe a blood debt." "Then let's settle it," Bjorn replied, stepping fully clear of the defensive line. "Single combat. Your life against mine. Win, and your men can take whatever they want from this village. Lose, and you sail away forever." It was a desperate gambit, but the only one that might spare the villagers. Grimmer considered the offer, weighing the certainty of eventual victory against the risk of personal defeat. "Single combat," he agreed finally, but with a modification. His smile was pure malice. "If you lose, your woman watches you die. Then she comes with me, a fitting trophy for such a victory." The words hit Bjorn like a war hammer to the chest. In challenging Grimmer directly, he'd thought only of protecting the village. He hadn't considered that Freydis might become a prize in the wager. "No," he said immediately, "she has nothing to do with this." "She has everything to do with it," Grimmer countered. "You've made her part of your story, Ironsoul. That makes her part of mine as well." From the watchtower came Freydis's voice, clear and determined. "I accept the terms." "Freydis, no!" Bjorn called up to her. "Yes," she replied firmly, "because I have faith in you. More faith than you have in yourself, apparently." Her words kindled something in Bjorn's chest, not rage this time, but pure determination. He thought of all she'd taught him about seeing beauty instead of battlefields, about choosing creation over destruction. But some battles couldn't be avoided, and some things were worth fighting for with everything you had. "Then let's finish this," he told Grimmer, raising Skullbiter in formal challenge. as the two warriors faced each other on the morning beach with an entire village's fate hanging in the balance. Bjorn realized that everything in his life had led to this moment. Every battle, every choice, every lonely year had brought him here, to fight not for glory or gold, but for love and the chance at redemption. The twist wasn't that Grimmer had found him, or even that the past had caught up with his new life. The twist was that for the first time in 30 years, Bjorn Ironsoul had something worth losing. The circle of combat formed itself with the ancient inevitability of ritual. Grimmer's raiders spread out along the waterline while the village defenders took positions on higher ground, creating an arena of sand and stone where two men would decide the fate of many. Bjorn felt the weight of every watching eye, the desperate hope of the villagers, the cruel anticipation of the outlaws, and above all, the unwavering faith radiating from Freydis in her tower perch. "It's been too long since I killed a famous warrior," Grimmer said as they began their formal approach, warhammer swinging lazily at his side. "The reputation of Bjorn Ironsoul will add considerable weight to my own legend." "Reputations are built on more than killing," Bjorn replied, though his grip tightened on Skullbiter's restored handle. The silver inlays Freydis had added caught the morning light, reminders of gentleness in a moment dedicated to violence, spoken like a man who's grown soft. Grimmer laughed. 3 years of playing fisherman have dulled your edge, brother killer. The Bjorn Ironsoul, I remember, would have charged me already, eager for blood. The words were calculated to provoke, to goad Bjorn into the berserker rage that had once made him nearly invincible. And Grimmer was right. The old Bjorn would have already succumbed to fury, would have thrown himself into battle with the mindless ferocity that terror had taught enemies to fear. But as Bjorn circled his opponent, he found something unexpected. The rage wouldn't come. For 3 years, he'd worried that his capacity for violence had simply been buried, not destroyed, that when true danger arrived, he would revert to the monster he'd once been. Instead, he felt only cold determination and crystal-clear awareness. He'd learned to see the world through different eyes, and that included this fight, where the berserker saw only targets to destroy, Bjorn now observed. Details with the precision Freydis had taught him. The slight favor Grimmer showed his left side, suggesting an old injury to his right shoulder. The way his stance revealed an emphasis on power over speed, the overconfidence that came from facing opponents who feared his reputation more than they. Studied his weaknesses. "You're thinking too much," Grimmer taunted, apparently interpreting Bjorn's calm assessment as hesitation. "The Ironsoul I knew trusted his instincts. This version looks like he's trying to remember which end of the axe cuts." "Maybe I'm just appreciating the morning," Bjorn replied, earning confused looks from both sides. "The way the light reflects off the water, how the seabirds call to each other. My friend taught me that beauty exists everywhere, even in moments like this." Grimmer's expression shifted from mockery to genuine concern. Either his opponent had gone completely mad, or something fundamental had changed about the legendary berserker. Neither possibility boded well for the plan he'd spent months refining. "Enough philosophy," Grimmer snarled, raising his warhammer. "Let's see if your newfound wisdom bleeds as red as your old fury." The first attack came with devastating force, a crushing overhead blow that would have shattered bone and metal alike. But where the old Bjorn might have met it head-on in a contest of pure strength, this version simply stepped aside, letting Grimmer's momentum carry him past before delivering a calculated strike with Skullbiter's handle to his opponent's extended elbow. Grimmer stumbled, more surprised than hurt, but already Bjorn could see the tactical situation shifting. His opponent had committed to a pattern of overwhelming aggression that left openings for someone patient enough to exploit them. "Stop dancing and fight!" Grimmer roared, swinging his hammer in a wide arc designed to prevent evasion. "I am fighting," Bjorn replied, ducking under the blow and scoring a shallow cut across Grimmer's thigh. "Just not the way you expected." The crowd's reaction was telling. Grimmer's raiders had grown quiet, their initial confidence shaken by their leader's inability to land a decisive blow. The villagers, meanwhile, began to whisper with growing excitement as they watched their defender methodically dismantle his larger opponent's aggression. But Bjorn knew the fight was far from over. Grimmer might be overconfident and overly aggressive, but he was still a seasoned warrior with strength and reach advantages. One mistake, one moment of overconfidence, and the tables could turn completely. "I know what you're doing," Grimmer said, breathing heavily as they circled each other again. "You think patience will win this fight, but I've got more endurance than you imagine, and all I need is one clean hit." To prove his point, Grimmer launched a series of calculated attacks, not the wild swings of his opening assault, but precise strikes aimed at forcing Bjorn into disadvantageous positions. The warhammer whistled through the air with lethal intent, each blow coming closer to its mark. Bjorn found himself giving ground, his earlier confidence tempered by respect for his opponent's adaptability. This wasn't the mindless brute he'd hoped to face, but a clever fighter who learned from his mistakes. The kind of enemy who'd killed many good warriors through patience and cunning. "There," Grimmer panted, having forced Bjorn back toward the rocky shoreline where footing grew treacherous. "Now we'll see how your pretty philosophy serves you when you're fighting for your life." The next exchange was brutal and desperate. Grimmer pressed his advantage ruthlessly, using his superior reach to keep Bjorn off balance, while the slippery rocks made every step uncertain. Skullbiter rang against the warhammer's iron head again and again, the impact sending vibrations through Bjorn's arms that warned of the weapon's limits. During one particularly vicious clash, Grimmer's hammer caught the axe near its head, the force of impact cracking the restored wooden handle. Bjorn felt the weapon loosen in his grip and knew he had perhaps minutes before Skullbiter would fail him completely. "I can smell your fear," Grimmer laughed, pressing forward with renewed vigor. "Just like your woman will smell it when I take her aboard my ship tonight." The crude threat sparked something in Bjorn's chest, not the old berserker rage, but something equally powerful and far more focused. The protective fury of a man defending what he loved most. "Her name is Freydis," Bjorn said quietly, his voice carrying deadly certainty, "and you'll never touch her." What followed was unlike any fighting Bjorn had ever done. Where the berserker rage had been a fire that consumed everything in its path, this new fury was like ice, cold, precise, and utterly implacable. He began to move with the flowing grace Freydis had tried to teach him, seeing the fight not as a series of individual attacks, but as a poem written in motion and steel. Grimmer found himself facing an opponent who seemed to anticipate his every move, who flowed around his attacks like water around stone. The warhammer that had served him so well began to feel clumsy and slow against Bjorn's newfound fluidity. "What are you?" Grimmer gasped, stumbling backward as a particularly elegant combination left 3 shallow cuts across his arms and chest. "I'm what I chose to become," Bjorn replied, advancing with steady determination despite Skullbiter's cracking handle. "Instead of what I was born to be." The philosophical answer seemed to enrage Grimmer more than any insult could have. With a roar of frustrated fury, he abandoned all pretense of tactical fighting and threw himself into a berserk charge of his own, the kind of desperate assault that either ended fights immediately or left the attacker fatally exposed. Bjorn saw the opening forming and knew he had one chance to end this. Skullbiter's handle wouldn't survive another major impact, and Grimmer's size meant that anything less than a killing blow would merely enrage him further. As his opponent charged, Bjorn thought not of battle tactics or warrior codes, but of Freydis watching from her tower, of the trust she'd placed in him, of the life they might build together if he could somehow survive the next few seconds. Time seemed to slow as the 2 warriors closed the final distance, both committed to attacks that would determine not just their own fates, but the future of everyone watching from the shore. In that crystalline moment of approaching collision, Bjorn finally understood what Freydis had been trying to teach him about seeing beauty in unexpected places. Because there was beauty in this, not in the violence itself, but in the purpose behind it. The choice to fight not for glory or revenge, but for love and the protection of innocence. For the first time in his life, Bjorn Ironsoul went into battle without rage, without fear, and without doubt. He went with nothing but love in his heart, and the unshakable conviction that some things were worth any sacrifice to protect. The collision came with the force of fate itself. Grimmer's war hammer descended in a crushing arc that would have split a normal man from crown to sternum, while Bjorn's damaged axe rose to meet it in what seemed like a hopeless parry. The weapons met with a sound like thunder, and Skullbiter's weakened handle finally surrendered to forces beyond its endurance. The ancient wood splintered with a crack that echoed across the beach, sending the axe head spinning away to land in the surf with a splash that marked the end of an era. For 30 years, that weapon had been Bjorn's constant companion, his means of survival, his path to legend. Now it lay broken and useless, while Grimmer's hammer continued its deadly descent. But instead of despair, Bjorn felt a strange sense of liberation. The weapon that had defined him for so long was gone, but he remained. More than that, he was free to choose what came next. Time stretched like heated metal as the warhammer approached his skull. In that expanded moment, Bjorn saw everything with perfect clarity. Grimmer's triumphant expression beginning to form, the spray of salt water catching morning light like scattered diamonds. Freydis leaning forward in her tower with her hands pressed to her mouth, and he saw the opening that Grimmer's overcommitment had created. Instead of trying to block or dodge, Bjorn stepped into the attack, catching Grimmer's extended wrist with both hands and using the larger man's momentum against him. The technique was one Magnus had shown him during their sparring sessions. Not a warrior's move, but a blacksmith's way of controlling heavy tools that threatened to slip from tired fingers. Grimmer's eyes widened as he felt his attack redirected. The warhammer's crushing force diverted harmlessly past Bjorn's shoulder. His feet, positioned for a devastating downward strike, found themselves tangled and off balance as the smaller man's unexpected counter turned his charge into an uncontrolled stumble. "Impossible!" Grimmer gasped, fighting to regain his balance. "No," Bjorn replied, maintaining his grip on his opponent's wrist while positioning himself for what came next. "Just different." What followed was a display of technique over strength that would have impressed any fighting master. Without his axe, Bjorn was forced to rely on skills learned in 100 wrestling matches with Shield brothers, knowledge gained from Magnus, about leverage and control, and most importantly, the patience Freydis had taught him to embrace. Where the old Bjorn would have sought to overpower his opponent through fury and determination, this version worked with methodical precision. He used Grimmer's size against him, turning each attempted strike into an opportunity to further unbalance the larger warrior. When Grimmer tried to bring his hammer up for another crushing blow, Bjorn stepped inside the arc and swept his legs. When Grimmer attempted to grapple, Bjorn slipped away like water, leaving his opponent clutching empty air. "Fight me properly," Grimmer roared, his earlier confidence evaporating as frustration mounted. "Stand and trade blows like a warrior." "I am fighting properly," Bjorn replied, evading another wild swing. "I'm fighting to win, not to prove anything." The psychological warfare was as important as the physical. With each failed attack, Grimmer grew more desperate and less controlled. His breathing became labored, his movements less precise. The warhammer that had seemed so intimidating began to feel like a burden rather than an advantage. Meanwhile, Bjorn felt himself settling into a rhythm that was entirely new, yet strangely familiar. This wasn't the berserker's dance of destruction he'd known for 30 years, but something more akin to the patient work of mending nets or the careful attention required to appreciate a sunset. Every movement had purpose, every choice served. the larger goal. The turning point came when Grimmer, driven beyond endurance by his inability to land a decisive blow, abandoned all strategy in favor of pure aggression. He raised the warhammer high over his head with both hands, preparing to bring it down, with enough force to shatter stone. It was exactly the opening Bjorn had been waiting for. As Grimmer committed to his final, desperate attack, Bjorn moved with the fluid grace of a man who had learned to see beauty in motion itself. He stepped to the side, caught Grimmer's extended arms, and used the larger man's own momentum to send him tumbling face first into the sand. The warhammer flew from Grimmer's grip, landing well out of reach, with a dull thud that seemed to echo like a funeral bell. For a moment, both warriors lay still, Grimmer stunned by his fall, Bjorn catching his breath and marveling at what had just occurred. Around them, the beach had fallen into absolute silence. Grimmer's raiders stared in disbelief at their fallen leader. The villagers watched with a mixture of joy and amazement as their protector rose slowly to his feet, unarmed but victorious. In her tower, Freydis pressed both hands to her heart, tears streaming down her face as she witnessed the impossible made real. The man she loved had not only survived, but had transformed himself in the crucible of combat, becoming something neither she nor he had dared to imagine possible. The legendary berserker was dead. In his place stood something far more dangerous, a warrior who fought not from rage but from love, who chose victory through wisdom rather than strength, who had learned that the greatest battles were won not by becoming a monster, but by remaining human. Grimmer struggled to his hands and knees, sand coating his red beard, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead where he'd struck a stone. The great warhammer lay beyond his reach, but defeat hadn't yet registered in his mind. For a man who'd built his entire identity on dominance through violence, the concept of losing to an unarmed opponent seemed impossible to process. "This isn't over," he snarled, spitting sand and blood. "I'll kill you with my bare hands if I have to." "It's over," Bjorn said quietly, making no move to press his advantage. "You've lost, Grimmer. Honor the agreement and sail away." "Honor?" Grimmer laughed. Bitterly, the sound harsh and broken. "You speak to me of honor? You who killed my brother and then disappeared into exile, rather than face the consequences?" "I faced the consequences every day for 3 years," Bjorn replied. "The question is whether you're strong enough to face yours." The words struck deeper than any weapon could have. Grimmer's entire journey to this remote village had been driven by his inability to accept his brother's death, to acknowledge that Hakon had chosen to fight and lost fairly. Now, confronted with his own defeat, he was being offered the same choice. Accept reality with dignity, or let bitterness consume him further. For a moment, something resembling wisdom flickered in Grimmer's eyes. The possibility of letting go, of choosing a different path than endless revenge. But 30 years of cultivating hatred had carved channels too deep for water to flow elsewhere. "Never," he whispered, then louder. "Never." Grimmer lunged forward, with desperate fury, hands reaching for Bjorn's throat. But the move was telegraphed, clumsy, born of emotion rather than strategy. Bjorn sidestepped easily and caught his opponent's arm, using Grimmer's momentum to send him stumbling past. What happened next would be debated in Ravenshollow for generations. Grimmer, thrown off balance by his missed attack, tried to catch himself on the slippery rocks at the water's edge. His foot slipped on seaweed-covered stone, and with a cry of surprise rather than pain, he pitched backward into the churning surf. Under normal circumstances, it would have been merely embarrassing. Grimmer was a strong swimmer, and the water wasn't particularly deep. But the morning's exertions had taken their toll, and the cold shock of submersion after heated combat proved more than his exhausted body could handle. He surfaced once, gasping and flailing, his eyes wide with the sudden understanding that death could come from something as simple as losing his footing. Then the current that had nearly claimed Freydis during the storm caught him, pulling him away from shore with inexorable force. "Help him!" Someone shouted from the watching crowd. Bjorn was already moving, wading into the surf without hesitation, despite having no weapon and no obligation to save the man who'd come to kill him. But Grimmer's pride proved stronger than his survival instinct. "Stay back," he managed to gasp between mouthfuls of salt water. "I don't need help from you." The current pulled him farther out, beyond the reach of any rescue attempt. Grimmer fought the water with the same fury he'd brought to combat, but the sea cared nothing for reputation or strength of will. His struggles grew weaker, more desperate, until finally the red beard disappeared beneath the waves. Silence settled over the beach like a shroud. Even Grimmer's raiders seemed stunned by the suddenness of their leader's end. Violence they understood, death in battle they could accept, but this random twist of fate left them adrift. Magnus broke the quiet first, his voice carrying the authority of age and experience. "It's finished," he announced to both sides. "The debt is paid. The combat's settled. There's nothing left to fight about." One of Grimmer's lieutenants, a scarred man with intelligent eyes, nodded slowly. "Aye, the Red is dead, and our oath died with him." He looked around at his companions. "We've no quarrel with farmers and fishermen." "Then take your ships and go," Bjorn said, his voice heavy with exhaustion that was more emotional than physical. "Find honest work somewhere. There's been enough death here." The raiders began withdrawing to their vessels without argument, their leader's demise having removed the driving purpose that held their band together. Within an hour, the black sails were disappearing into the morning mist, carrying away the last remnant of Bjorn's violent past. As the final ship vanished beyond the headland, Freydis came running down from the watchtower, her careful composure finally breaking as she threw herself into Bjorn's arms. He caught her close, marveling at how right it felt to hold her, how complete it made him feel. "I was so afraid," she whispered against his chest. "When your axe broke, when he kept coming, but you never doubted," Bjorn said, stroking her hair. "Even when I doubted myself, you believed I would find a way." "I believed in who you've become," she corrected. "The man who chooses protection over destruction, who sees beauty even in moments of violence." Around them, the villagers began to gather, their faces bright with relief and something approaching wonder. They'd witnessed something unprecedented. A legendary warrior who'd won not through superior violence, but through superior character. The old Bjorn Ironsoul was truly dead, drowned along with Grimmer in the cold waters of the fjord. What remained was something new, something that had been growing throughout the long months of peaceful exile, but had needed this final test to fully emerge. A man capable of love. 3 months after the battle, Bjorn sat on the same clifftop where he and Freydis had shared their first honest conversation about the future. The late summer evening painted the fjord in shades of gold and crimson, and the village below hummed with the peaceful activity of another day's end. Smoke rose from cookfires, children played in the market square, and fishing boats returned with their evening catch. But tonight was different. Tonight, the entire village had gathered for a celebration that would mark not just the changing of seasons, but the beginning of a new chapter in all their lives. "Nervous?" Freydis asked, settling beside him on the weathered stone that had become their favorite spot for watching sunsets. "Terrified," Bjorn admitted with a smile. "I've faced armies without fear, but the thought of speaking vows in front of the whole village makes my hands shake." Freydis laughed, the sound as bright as the evening light on water. "Just remember what you told me about seeing beauty instead of battlefields. This isn't a test to survive. It's a joy to be celebrated." She was right, of course. The betrothal ceremony that would take place at tomorrow's dawn was nothing like the formal political marriages Bjorn had witnessed in great halls. This would be simple, heartfelt, witnessed by people who'd grown to care for them both. Magnus would speak the traditional words, Thorvald would give his blessing, and the whole village would feast afterward on fish and bread and strong ale. "I still can't quite believe it's real," Bjorn said, taking her hand in his. 6 months ago, I thought I'd spend the rest of my life alone. Now you're stuck with a woman who talks too much about poetry and can't cook fish properly, Freydis finished teasingly. Now I'm blessed with a woman who taught me that the world contains more beauty than I'd ever imagined, and who sees something worth loving in a man everyone else rightfully feared. The gentle correction made her blush, but she didn't look away. In the month since Grimmer's defeat, they'd grown completely comfortable with each other, learning to navigate the delicate territory between friendship and something deeper. Their courtship had been conducted largely in public, with half the village acting as benevolent chaperones, and the other half offering unsolicited advice about everything from wedding customs to child-rearing. It should have been awkward, but instead, it had felt like being welcomed into a family larger than either had ever known. The whole village is talking about the poem you're composing for tomorrow, Bjorn said. Thorvald claims it's the finest verse he's ever heard. It's about perspectives that don't usually get heard, Freydis replied with a sly smile. A certain warrior's view of laying down weapons in favor of love. His thoughts on choosing creation over destruction. How it feels to discover that the strongest thing about him isn't his sword arm. And what conclusion does this poem reach? That the greatest victories aren't won on battlefields, but in quiet moments when two people choose to trust each other with their deepest truths. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun continued its descent toward the horizon. Below them, lanterns began appearing in windows as families gathered for evening meals. Magnus's forge glowed red in the gathering dusk. Children's laughter echoed off the water. It was, Bjorn reflected, exactly the kind of scene he'd never thought to appreciate during his years of constant travel and warfare. A place where people knew each other's names and stories, where daily life followed patterns older than memory, where the greatest excitement was usually a good catch of fish or news from a neighboring settlement. For a man who'd once measured his worth by the number of enemies he could kill, the profound ordinariness of it all felt like a miracle. "I have something for you," Freydis said suddenly, producing a wrapped bundle from beneath her cloak. A betrothal gift. Bjorn unwrapped the package to find a new axe handle carved from ash wood and fitted with silver inlays that matched the one she'd added to Skullbiter's original design. But instead of runes for war and victory, these patterns depicted gentler themes: waves, stars, intertwined branches that spoke of growth and connection. "The head is being reforged by Magnus," she explained. "Smaller than before, balanced for woodworking rather than warfare, a tool for building instead of destroying." Bjorn ran his fingers along the smooth wood, marveling at the craftsmanship and thought that had gone into the gift. "It's beautiful, but I'm not sure I deserve—" "You deserve every happiness," Freydis interrupted firmly. "You deserve love, peace, and the chance to build something lasting. Don't let the man you used to be convince you otherwise." The conviction in her voice dispelled the last shadows of doubt that had lingered in Bjorn's heart. For months, part of him had worried that his past would somehow taint their future, that a man with so much blood on his hands couldn't truly deserve the gentle life she offered. But looking at her face in the fading light, seeing the absolute certainty of her love, he finally understood what she'd been trying to teach him all along. Redemption wasn't something you earned through suffering or penance. It was something you accepted through grace and then honored through your choices going forward. "Tomorrow," he said, "when Magnus asks me to speak my vows, I'm going to tell the whole village that loving you has taught me the difference between being feared and being respected, between taking and giving, between conquering and protecting. And I'm going to tell them," Freydis replied, "that you've shown me courage has many faces. Sometimes it looks like standing alone against 30 warriors. Sometimes it looks like one person seeing beauty in another when the rest of the world sees only flaws." As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, they made their way back toward the village hand in hand, ready to begin the rest of their lives together. Behind them, the eternal fjord reflected starlight like scattered silver coins, a reminder that some things endured beyond the span of any single life, and that the greatest stories weren't always the ones carved in stone by poets and historians. Sometimes, the greatest stories were the quiet ones. A warrior who learned to love, a woman who taught him how, and a village that welcomed them both home.